joining you from Canada. I'm very grateful to be part of this from so far away, thanks to new technologies that make that possible. So I learned about philosophical counseling quite recently, and I found it really very intriguing, of course, in its own right, but I also immediately noticed how much utility it might have in the field that I work in, which is conflict resolution. So I teach at a law school here in Canada, and I teach a course called alternative dispute resolution. And I'm especially interested within that in a process of dispute resolution called mediation. So what I wanted to do is just share with you where I think philosophical counseling's contribution can lie within the law and dispute or conflict resolution context. So conflict resolution in a legal context is really quite formalistic. So the primary method of resolving a dispute is through adjudication, where the parties come in and they argue about what the law is and then how it should apply in a particular case. And then a judge will declare what the law is and then apply it to the facts. And that will result in basically a winner take all authoritative outcome. So that's how disputes are usually resolved via the traditional legal system. But in around the 1970s, at least here in North America, it was around the 70s, there were critiques mounting on this type of adjudicative dispute resolution system. And part of those critiques involved recognizing that law and the legal process isn't really always, or maybe even ever, a great way to resolve disputes because it's adversarial. It doesn't emphasize relationship repair or compromise. It's not dialogical, which is a theme that has run through this session. And it certainly doesn't prioritize self-determination or any type of self-awakening or self-realization, because it's essentially just a judge that's going to make an authoritative decision for the parties on the basis of pre-existing norms, which are laws. So these critiques kind of grounded the rise of a new method of dispute resolution called mediation. Not that it's particularly new, but it was new in the legal world. So mediation involves basically a neutral third party who ideally will facilitate the parties to a dispute in reaching a mutually acceptable resolution on their own. And this method is really quite different from the usual adjudicative system, because parties in a mediation process would ideally engage in a dialogue with each other and hopefully come to a resolution that suits them. And the outcome that they come to is not dependent on legal norms or some sort of judicial decree. And so it's very different from the usual adjudicative context. So although there was a lot of resistance to this method of dispute resolution within the legal community early on, and I think part of it was a fear of a new way of doing things, and also maybe a bit of turf wars as well, in the sense that lawyers thought, well, don't encroach on our realm. But over time, it has been incorporated into many civil justice systems worldwide, and certainly that includes India. So generally speaking, I see this as a positive development, because mediation, if it's done well, it can really empower parties to co-create a just and fair resolution for themselves through a dialogical exploration of both of their interests, their perceptions, their values. So it's a much more holistic avenue of dispute resolution than adjudication allows for. So I think it's a good thing that the law world has kind of opened its heart and mind to mediation. But the problem that I see is that, and this is where I think philosophical counseling is relevant, but the problem I see is that mediation programs that are connected to the courts, they often slip back into just a simple legalistic approach. So they don't really make space for open and free dialogue and self-exploration, which is what makes mediation valuable in my view. But instead, what happens is the parties, and this is usually happening through their lawyers, they tend to focus even in a mediation on what is a judge likely to decide? And then they just throw numbers at each other, and it becomes like bargaining in a market. So in that context, then even in a mediation, the law remains a kind of a primary normative framework, rather than mediation being a space where parties can actually self-create the norms that are going to guide their resolution. So when this kind of reduction to law happens, to me, I see that as kind of like an erasure of the real transformative potential that mediation can have. So I think there are several reasons for why this can happen. And in part, it might be because the people who are involved in a mediation or a dispute are usually quite steeped in the legal system. So the legal norms remain primary, and the dispute resolution then obviously revolves around the law, rather than around helping people to actually create norms themselves based on their own value system, because that involves actually doing a lot of hard work, and digging into and even challenging a person's own worldviews. And the issue is, I think that the lawyers are not very good at that. And so, we're good at figuring out what legal norms are and then applying them to resolve a conflict, but we're not very good at enabling people to understand what it means to self-determine what they think is the right way forward. Or another way to put it, I guess, is helping people determine what their personal philosophy or worldview or approach to life is, and then rooting their way forward or their resolution to a dispute in that personal philosophy. So this is where I think philosophical counseling can help, because as a methodology of dialogue, of critical self-discovery, of empathetic communication, I think it aligns very well with what I view as the best version of mediation. And as a result, it can provide an avenue of how to approach mediation so that parties are actually empowered to understand themselves and gain kind of coherence and depth in terms of their personal worldviews, and then to use that understanding to come to a resolution on their own, instead of saying, well, I'll leave it to a judge to tell me how to resolve the dispute. So I think figuring out how to give effect to that is essential to getting the best that we can out of mediation. So as I said in the beginning, I do think philosophical counseling can help us to do that, but I reiterate that I am new to the field, so I'm hoping to learn from others about this, which I already have from the previous two speakers. But I just wanted to share some, I think, preliminary thoughts that I've been brewing on how philosophical counseling as a field, with all of its debates and disagreements and richness, can ground mediation theory and practice. So first of all, I think the foundational goal of philosophical counseling, as I said, aligns quite precisely with the broad goal of mediation. So that is to equip people to critically perceive their own worldviews, and to see then how those worldviews are influencing their actions, their approaches to conflict. So in a mediation context, that allows someone to really appreciate why they are coming at a conflict in a particular way. And it helps them to come to a self-integrated understanding of what they think is just, first of all, rather than assuming that whatever the legal system does is necessarily just, which it isn't. You can have space in a mediation to come to an understanding of what you think is just, and then to determine what course of action to take. So the value of this is it gives a person a sense of autonomy and empowerment. And I think that's the best part of mediation when you compare it to adjudication, because in adjudication, you don't really have a sense of autonomy or empowerment. You have a sense of being a subject. You're subject to the law. So mediation is a place where it can give people a sense of personalized decision-making that works for them, as opposed to just being a subject of the law and legal system. So because of this basic alignment and purpose between mediation and philosophical counseling, I think that the techniques that are used and debated within philosophical counseling discourse would be instructive in the mediation context too. So some of the helpful techniques that I've come across include things like engaging a client in a process of trying to verbalize their concepts, their values, their perceptions. And I think this is really relevant in the context of a micro dispute or a conflict, because concepts, values, perceptions, they're all quite likely to have relevance in varying degrees where there's a conflict taking place. So for instance, a party could be encouraged to really kind of like dig into their concept of what constitutes fairness or justice or success, and to determine how these concepts might be impacting their approach to the dispute. In terms of values, a lot of conflicts have ethical or value-based components, of course. So upon philosophical introspection, through the guidance of a counselor type person, someone might find that his or her sense of, what's right or what's ethically viable, that might be hazy or internally inconsistent. And that can lead to a sense of being unsure of what to do, or internal conflict, maybe as in Krishnamurti's terms, perhaps, but it could lead to indecision. So once you're able to perceive and critically analyze your own ethical underpinnings, that could result in a better formulated set of values, I guess, and it can assist in well-reasoned conflict resolution. And then in terms of perceptions, you can imagine that often at the heart of a conflict, there are faulty or one-sided perceptions. So an assisted examination of what perceptions are influencing the parties can make space for reevaluation or recalibration of those perceptions, and that can then help the parties move towards resolution at a much deeper level than an adjudicative movement can allow. So ascertaining the and verbalizing the concepts, the values, the perceptions, I think can help parties to determine, why they take the positions that they're taking in a particular conflict. And it can help people move away from positionality, which is usually a feeling of like, I am right, you were wrong, and into a place more of curiosity and exploration of the interests that lie underneath any of the commitments that we take or any of the actions that we take. So in terms of understanding the skills of actually doing this or giving effect to helping someone come to perceive their values, concepts, perceptions in a mediation, I think, again, the legal field has much to learn from the skills of counseling in a philosophical manner. So in my understanding, there's several philosophical counselors, and I appreciated Rajan's comments that it should be a non-exclusive approach, but many I think, use methods like Socratic questioning and critically analyzing basic presumptions. And I think gaining aptitude in that skill of questioning has great applicability in mediation context, because questioning allows a counselor to, avoid, and I think Dr. Bhumika also noted this to a degree, that it allows a counselor to avoid imparting any particular knowledge or imposing any particular principles on the client. And that's important in a mediation context where the mediator should be striving to remain neutral. But the questioning opens a space for the client to take on the responsibility, let's say, of their own self-understanding. So I think that if we can, as lawyers, learn how to ask questions that can nudge a person towards critical thinking, openness to the thinking of other people, that can bring about a transformative system of conflict resolution. So, as I understand, if one kind of gently asks questions like, what do you mean when you say that? Or why is that important to you? Or what else could be the cause of your perception? Then you can assist the parties in getting a more thoughtful and deeper understanding of their conflict. And so presumably, I think this would, enliven a more genuine dialogue about the conflict and its eventual resolution. Now, this might be a bit idealistic, but I think it's, at least in theory, a good grounding for ideal mediation. So along with enabling that kind of intellectual understanding of oneself, I've also seen some literature in the philosophical field emphasizing, I guess, the idea of empathetic understanding, or maybe in Dr. Bhumika's way of articulating it, like a heart-based understanding. And so the idea is that philosophical dialogue should also enable clients to acknowledge the kind of like holistic experiences of other people, including perceiving their emotions and their ideals. And this type of understanding has I think, clear implications in a conflict resolution context, because it could result in less hostility in the relationship between parties, and it could give a sense that there's a shared understanding towards one another. So although we may not experience, the same emotions in any given situations, we're all susceptible to feeling the same emotions in various circumstances. So, for instance, we might not be able to justify another person's jealousy in a given instance, but we know that we have felt unjustified jealousy ourselves at times too. And that recognition then, I think, can result in a sense of commonality. So that can assist parties then in recognizing our basic fundamental similarities, and the relationship may begin to feel less antagonistic. So, this ability to maintain and strengthen relationships, I think, is, again, one of the prime benefits of pursuing conflict resolution through mediation rather than adjudication. So again, a place where philosophical counseling can help. So, in the end, these are just some things that I've picked up here and there from reading some, I think, kind of the basic papers in this field. But now that I've had a chance to explore philosophical counseling a little bit, and, having noticed what I think to be the considerable alignment between the two fields, I do think that the insights of philosophical counseling can be, tremendously beneficial in creating and promoting a well-functioning mediation process that can really serve as a strong and viable complement to the traditional adjudicative dispute resolution system, which I still think is relevant and important. But I think mediation can be a great complement as long as it's grounded in something as rich as philosophical counseling. So I'm looking forward to developing this line of thinking further. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.